At Christmas, Grandma gave presents to all her grandchildren except one girl, but no one expected what her father did right at the table. Subscribe and write in the comments what city you're from. Snow had begun to fall in soft, weightless flakes outside their apartment window, tracing delicate patterns on the glass that 6-year-old Elia pressed her nose against with growing excitement. The city was slowly being blanketed in white, muffling the world beyond in a kind of quiet magic that only children seemed to fully hear. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and warm cocoa filled the modest kitchen as Melanie stood by the stove, stirring a pot and humming low under her breath. Behind her, John crouched near the small artificial tree they had decorated together, adjusting a crooked ornament shaped like a fox, Elia's favorite animal. She turned from the window suddenly, her eyes wide. "Do you think Grandma's house will have a big tree?" she asked, tugging on the sleeve of John's sweater. He smiled and pulled her gently into his lap, brushing a soft curl from her forehead. "It's the biggest tree I've ever seen, sweetheart," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "You'll love it." He didn't say more than that. He didn't mention the way his stomach had twisted when the invitation arrived 2 weeks ago, crisp and polite, like a formality rather than a gesture of warmth. It had been signed in his mother's careful script, each letter tight and perfect. "We would be pleased to host you and your family for Christmas this year." No mention of Melanie. No mention of Elia. Just your family. Still, it was more than they'd expected. Melanie had read the note twice before setting it down on the counter, her face unreadable. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," John admitted, "but maybe it's a start." Melanie wasn't convinced. It wasn't the first time she had walked into a space where she wasn't wanted, where her presence had been met with silence or strained civility. But she'd done it for John before, and now she'd do it for Elia. When they had first met, over a decade ago, in a college ethics seminar, John had been the quiet one in the back of the room, the one who didn't raise his hand unless he had something to say. Melanie had been drawn to that calm, to the steadiness behind his eyes. Their love had grown slowly but deeply, and when they married 3 years later, she had walked down the aisle fully aware of the tension simmering beneath the surface of John's family. His parents had attended, yes, but they hadn't smiled. They hadn't danced, and they certainly hadn't welcomed her. The years that followed were filled with small hurts, carefully folded into cards and calls and the empty space between visits. Then came the struggle to conceive. Miscarriages, failed IVF, nights of silent grief, and finally, the decision to adopt. It hadn't been Plan B, not really. It had been the first step towards something new, something whole. They found Elia through a local agency. She was 5 when they met her, a quiet, serious girl who had lost more than most adults ever would. She hadn't said a word during their first walk together, but halfway through the park, she had slipped her hand into Melanie's. That was all it took. That was the moment she became theirs. Elia had called Melanie Mom within weeks, unprompted and without hesitation. And she had called John Dad from the very beginning. It was as natural as breathing. But John's parents had never quite followed suit. When they visited once, shortly after the adoption was finalized, his mother had looked at Elia with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Well, aren't you a little sweetheart?" She didn't ask questions, she didn't bend down to Elia's height, and she didn't include her in the family photo that was taken before they left. John had noticed. Melanie had noticed. Elia had noticed too, though she never said anything. Now, standing at the threshold of another attempt, maybe a final one, John was trying to hope. He wanted to believe that something had changed, that perhaps his parents had come to terms with their son's life, his choices, his daughter. But part of him knew better. In the week leading up to their trip, John stayed up late most nights preparing. He wrapped gifts in brown paper and tied them with twine, wrote each name by hand. He found a velvet dress for Elia that shimmered with tiny snowflakes. And one evening, after Melanie and Elia had gone to bed, he opened his laptop and completed a DNA test submission. He didn't need the results, not really. He knew Elia was his daughter, but some part of him, that small, wounded part that had grown up under his parents' roof, needed to be ready, just in case. Melanie, meanwhile, busied herself with packing and baking and smoothing every possible edge that might scrape their daughter's heart. She practiced with Elia how to greet relatives she'd never met. She prepared extra gifts in case others forgot. She packed Elia's favorite books, her fox plushie, and a notebook for drawing. Through it all, Elia never stopped smiling. She chattered about sledding and gingerbread and singing carols in a big family room. She made little drawings for each cousin, folded them carefully, and tucked them into a glittery envelope. "So they know I love them," she explained solemnly. The day before they left, Melanie found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, cutting stars from gold paper. "For Grandma," she said proudly, "I'm going to hang them in her window." Melanie had to step out of the room. On the morning of their departure, the three of them stood in the apartment's narrow hallway, checking bags and coats. Elia was dressed in her new dress and puffy pink jacket, her cheeks flushed with anticipation. John carried the presents. Melanie held the directions and a thermos of coffee. The air was heavy with everything unspoken. As they drove north, the city gave way to long, empty stretches of forest and fields blanketed in snow. The car was filled with Christmas music and Elia's voice, soft and pure as she sang along. Melanie sat in the passenger seat, her hands tight in her lap. John glanced at her once, then reached across and took her hand. The house appeared just past dusk, its roof lines glittering with white lights, a massive wreath on the front door. Smoke curled from the chimney. It looked like a postcard. Perfect, untouched. John parked the car slowly, his heart beginning to race. Elia leaned forward, eyes wide. "Is that Grandma's house?" she whispered. "It is," he said. "We're here." He got out first, walked around the car, and helped Elia from her seat. She immediately reached for Melanie's hand, holding tight as they climbed the stone steps together. The door opened before they knocked. His mother stood there, framed in warm light, wearing a cream sweater and red lipstick. She smiled, a small, tight smile, and looked at John first. "You made it," she said, stepping aside. She embraced him briefly, then turned to Melanie with a nod and finally to Elia. "Hello," she said, voice flat. "You must be Elia." Elia beamed and held out a small envelope. "I made this for you." His mother hesitated only a moment before taking it. "Thank you," she said, then turned away. "Come in, dinner's almost ready." Inside, the house was alive with voices and laughter. John's brothers were already there, with their wives and children all scattered around the high-ceilinged living room. A massive tree sparkled in the corner, adorned with golden ornaments. Firelight danced across polished floors. Elia's eyes widened in awe. She stepped forward, tugging her mother's hand. "It's like a castle," she whispered. John watched his daughter, his wife, his mother, and then he noticed the looks. Subtle, fleeting. A hesitation here, a pause there, as if Elia's presence needed to be explained. He looked around. No stocking hung for her, no name tag on the place settings, no family photo with room for 3 more. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. That night, as the family gathered for dinner, Alia sat quietly between John and Melanie, her hands folded in her lap. She smiled when spoken to. She answered politely. She passed dishes with care. But no one asked her favorite food. No one asked about school or toys or her drawings. Melanie watched it all unfold, her face serene but her spine stiff. She caught the cold politeness in every word, the careful omission of names, the subtle exclusion of their daughter from every shared memory. She knew this game. She had played it before. But now the stakes were higher. As they got ready for bed that night, Elia hummed softly to herself, tucking her fox under the covers. "Tomorrow is present day," she said, eyes shining. "I think I saw a purple one with a snowman. Maybe that one is mine." Melanie kissed her forehead. "Maybe," she said. In the guest room, John sat at the edge of the bed, staring at his suitcase. His hand moved to the folder inside, the documents he hadn't told anyone about. The truth on paper. He didn't want to need them. He prayed he wouldn't, but as the snow deepened outside, as the house grew quiet, he couldn't shake the feeling in his chest, the one that whispered that hope alone might not be enough. And morning was coming. Morning broke with a hush, the kind of quiet that comes only with fresh snow. The world outside John's childhood home was blanketed in white. The trees bowed under the weight of frost and silence. Inside, the house stirred gradually, filled with the aroma of fresh coffee, cinnamon rolls, and the low hum of relatives waking up and moving about. The fireplace crackled softly in the living room, casting amber shadows across the rug. Alia was the first to rise. She sat up in bed with her fox tucked under one arm and blinked at the window where frost etched lace across the glass. For a moment, she simply stared, as if absorbing the stillness, before sliding from beneath the covers and tiptoeing across the wooden floor. The house was unfamiliar, but not frightening. She moved with a mixture of curiosity and care, her small feet quiet against the floorboards. Downstairs, the adults were already beginning their morning routine. John stood in the kitchen pouring orange juice, while Melanie adjusted the belt of her robe and scanned the room, noting how everything looked untouched since the last time they'd been here. Same pictures on the walls, portraits of John and his brothers as children, graduation photos, wedding shots of his siblings, but none of their own family. Not a single photo of Elia. Her absence from the walls was loud, even in silence. Elia appeared at the bottom of the stairs, eyes bright, voice soft. "Good morning." His mother looked up from her teacup, paused, and nodded once. "Morning." John forced a smile. "You sleep okay?" he asked. She nodded, climbing onto a bar stool and swinging her legs slowly back and forth beneath the counter. "I like it here. It smells like Christmas." Melanie crossed the room and kissed her daughter's head. "That's because Grandma bakes cinnamon rolls every Christmas Eve." His mother didn't respond. She turned back to her tea, her face unreadable. Soon, the house was alive again. Boots clomping in from the cold, cousins racing through the hallway, laughter bouncing off the walls. The other children, all light-haired and fair-skinned, eyed Elia curiously. A few approached her shyly, offering a toy or a shared giggle. Others simply watched from a distance. Elia, to her credit, navigated it all with the quiet dignity she had always carried. She extended her drawings to them, little folded squares with snowflakes and foxes, her name carefully written in the corner. Some accepted them with murmured thanks. Some didn't. John's father emerged from his study mid-morning, a man whose voice still carried authority even in his silence. He gave John a firm pat on the shoulder, Melanie a brief nod, and then looked at Elijah. His gaze lingered a second too long. "So, this is her," he said. John stiffened slightly. "This is Elijah." His father gave a soundless huff, almost a laugh. "She looks like your mother's side," he said, as if it explained everything. Melanie turned away, her jaw tight. The day passed in a blur of activity. Baking, setting tables, wrapping last-minute gifts. Elia offered to help wherever she could. She carried napkins to the table, stirred frosting for cookies, hummed carols under her breath. Each time she smiled at someone, her smile grew a little more tentative, like she was unsure whether it was welcome. John stayed close to her. He watched the way his mother seemed to maneuver around Elijah. Never cruel, but never warm either. Not a touch, not a question, not a glance that lingered more than politeness required. Melanie noticed too. She always noticed. Later that afternoon, while the children gathered in the den to decorate gingerbread houses, Elia sat carefully at the end of the table, placing gumdrops with meticulous care. The other kids chattered, laughed, teased each other playfully. No one teased Elia. No one included her either. Her house was neat and beautiful, with licorice shingles and powdered sugar snow, but no one asked her to show it off. John stood nearby, holding a mug of lukewarm cider, talking to his brother Daniel, but his eyes never left Elijah. "You all settled in?" Daniel asked. John nodded. "Yeah, it's good to see everyone." Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "So, how's Elia adjusting?" "She's not adjusting. She belongs," John said simply. Daniel raised his hand slightly as if to say he meant no harm, and turned the conversation to football. But the question lingered in the air like smoke. Dinner that night was grand in presentation. Roast beef, scalloped potatoes, roasted carrots, 3 kinds of pie. Everyone took their seats at the long table with place cards written in gold ink. Elia's name was not among them. John noticed it first. His eyes scanned the table, his breath catching. Melanie said nothing, simply pulled a chair closer to hers and seated Elijah beside her without a word, but the omission was deafening. As the meal went on, Elijah participated quietly, responding when spoken to, complimenting the food, even laughing once when one of her cousins made a silly joke. But no one asked about her school. No one asked what she liked to read or what she hoped to get from Santa. She existed at the edge of things, tolerated but never embraced. After dessert, the family moved to the living room for games and stories. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the faces of John's parents, who sat together on the sofa, glasses of wine in hand. John watched them closely. They looked relaxed, content, untouched by the tension they had quietly sown into the evening. Elia curled up in the armchair near the window, her fox tucked beneath her chin, a sketchbook open in her lap. She drew quietly, lines forming a snowy landscape, a small house with a smoking chimney, a tall tree in the yard. She added a little girl near the door and a woman beside her. She hesitated before adding a third figure. John crouched beside her. "What you drawing?" "Our house," she said, "and us." He smiled, brushing her hair back gently. "Looks beautiful." She looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they like me?" John swallowed. "Of course they do." Elia looked down again. "They don't talk to me much." He didn't know what to say, because it was true, and because a lie would cost more than a silence. That night, as they settled into the guest room, Melanie stood by the window staring out at the snow. John sat on the bed, staring at the documents tucked away in his suitcase, the lines of legal text, the seal, the DNA confirmation. "She's trying," John said, though he didn't sound convinced. Melanie didn't turn around. "No, she's managing appearances. There's a difference." Alia, already in bed, stirred slightly. "Mom?" she whispered. Melanie turned, softening. "I'm here, baby." "Tomorrow is a present day, right?" "That's right." "I think my gift is the one with the purple paper. I saw it under the tree." Melanie kissed her forehead. "Maybe it is." And in that moment, John felt the first fracture run through the hope he had held onto for weeks. Something was wrong. Not obvious, not loud, but undeniable. A quiet, insidious absence of love. The kind that slips in and hides behind manners. The kind that tells a child she does not belong without ever speaking a word. And morning, again, was coming. Alia woke up before dawn. The house was still and dark, the kind of deep quiet that only snow-covered mornings could bring. She lay for a few moments in the warmth of the guest bed, clutching her fox close to her chest, listening to the occasional creak of old floorboards and the distant rustle of the wind outside the window. Christmas morning had always been magical in her imagination. A day filled with color and music, the scent of cinnamon, and the joy of unwrapping something chosen just for her. She sat up and rubbed her eyes. The shadows in the room were still thick, but she could make out the soft folds of the velvet dress hanging on the closet door. It shimmered even in the half-light, and she smiled. She slipped from beneath the covers and tiptoed across the cold wooden floor, careful not to wake her parents. Her dress felt like a promise as she pulled it over her head and smoothed it down with both hands. She turned slowly in front of the mirror and imagined herself walking down the stairs into a room full of love. By the time John stirred, Alia was already seated on the edge of the bed, legs swinging, her hands folded politely in her lap. Her eyes were bright and hopeful. He blinked at her, then at the clock on the nightstand, then smiled sleepily. "Someone's excited." "I didn't sleep much," she admitted, "but I wasn't tired." He sat up and brushed a hand over her curls. "You look beautiful." She beamed. "Do you think my present is under the tree?" "I think I saw a purple one last night with a snowman on it. That might be mine." John swallowed the knot in his throat. "Maybe," he said, his voice careful. Melanie sat up slowly behind them, already watching the two of them with quiet intensity. Her expression said everything she didn't speak out loud. She had not slept well either. They dressed together, John tying Elia's shoes while Melanie helped her fix the ribbon in her hair. There was something ceremonial in the moment, as though they were preparing for a performance, and in a way they were. Downstairs, the house was beginning to stir. Footsteps overhead, voices muffled behind closed doors, the clatter of pans from the kitchen. Alia took Melanie's hand as they descended the stairs. The living room had been transformed overnight. Lights twinkled from the tall tree in the corner, its branches heavy with ornaments, ribbons, and bows. Beneath it sat a mountain of colorfully wrapped gifts in every shape and size. The fireplace glowed. Soft instrumental music played from the speakers. It was everything Alia had dreamed of. The other children were already there, circling the tree like satellites. They squealed and giggled, pointing at boxes and comparing sizes, guessing at their contents. Alia joined them hesitantly, her steps light, her face glowing. One by one, the adults trickled in. John's brothers and their wives still in pajamas, holding coffee cups and greeting each other with sleepy smiles. His parents entered last. His mother brisk and elegant in a dark green sweater, his father silent beside her. "All right, everyone," she announced with a clap of her hands. "Find a seat. You know how we do this." The children scrambled into a circle around the tree, bouncing with anticipation. Each child had a designated spot, an old tradition in the house, and Alia found herself at the end, beside a cousin who barely acknowledged her presence. Still, she sat with perfect posture, hands clasped in her lap, her smile fixed and patient. John and Melanie stood near the doorway, watching. Margaret, John's mother, began distributing gifts one at a time, reading each name aloud and handing the package to the appropriate child. The room filled with laughter and tearing paper, the delighted gasps of children discovering dolls, games, and gadgets. Cameras clicked, voices rose. Elia clapped each time someone opened a present, her joy genuine, even as her own name went unspoken. She looked toward the purple box with the snowman again. It hadn't moved. No one had touched it. Her eyes kept returning to it, and each time her smile faltered just slightly before she lifted it again, like a curtain being raised. One by one, the pile under the tree grew smaller. Fewer boxes, fewer bows, fewer names being called. John felt it before Melanie did. His breath slowed, his jaw tightened. He looked over at his daughter, still sitting upright, still smiling, but now blinking rapidly, as if trying to chase away dust. The last few gifts were handed out. Laughter filled the room. Paper was strewn everywhere, and Alia sat empty-handed. She turned her head and looked at John. Her voice was so soft it nearly disappeared. "Did Grandma forget mine?" John glanced toward the tree, pretending to search. "Maybe it's still under there," he said. He stepped forward, his voice gentle but loud enough to be heard. "Hey, is there one for Elia that didn't make it out?" The room fell silent. Heads turned. Margaret straightened. She did not look surprised. She did not look embarrassed. She looked annoyed. "We only bought gifts for family," she said, her voice cold and firm. Melanie went still. John didn't move. Elia's hands slowly folded in her lap. John's voice cracked as he spoke. "She is family." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That's not settled." A soft murmur moved through the room. A cousin fidgeted with ribbon. One of the sisters-in-law bent down to collect wrapping paper. No one looked at Elia. Melanie stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for her daughter's shoulder, but Elia didn't flinch. She simply nodded, a small, controlled motion, as if something inside her had clicked into place. John felt as if the ground had tilted beneath him. Elia didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just sat there, quiet and still, her expression unreadable. And no one said a word. No one asked Margaret to explain. No one said it was wrong. They all simply moved on. Someone suggested breakfast. Someone else turned the music up a little louder. A tray of muffins appeared. John watched as his daughter slipped away from the circle and retreated to the corner of the room near the window. She curled up in the chair and stared outside, her fox held tightly in her arms. Melanie followed and knelt beside her. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered. Elia nodded. "It's okay, Mommy. Maybe next year." John's mother had returned to her coffee. She chatted with a neighbor about the weather. John couldn't breathe. Every instinct in him wanted to scream, to grab his daughter and leave, to throw the untouched gifts into the fire. But he didn't. Not yet. He stood there, trembling, watching the woman who had once held him as a baby act as though his child did not exist. He had never hated silence before. But now it was a weapon. and it was cutting straight through his daughter. Later, they sat at the long dining table eating breakfast no one tasted. Alia pushed her food around her plate. John didn't speak. Melanie's eyes burned, but she held herself together for her daughter's sake. Afterward, the other children ran to the den to play with their new toys. Alia returned to the armchair by the window, drawing quietly in her sketchbook. No one invited her to join. No one noticed that she didn't. The day went on like a film in slow motion. People laughed, drank, exchanged stories. John's parents never brought it up again. Neither did Alia, but something had shattered. That night, back in the guest room, Alia brushed her teeth in silence. She climbed into bed without asking for a story. She stared at the ceiling, her fox beside her, the sketchbook tucked under her pillow. "Mom," she whispered. Melanie turned from the mirror. "Yes, baby?" "Do you think maybe she didn't know I was coming?" Melanie swallowed hard. She knew. A pause. "Maybe she just doesn't know me yet." Melanie couldn't speak. She simply walked to the bed and knelt beside it, holding her daughter's small hand until her breathing slowed. Across the room, John sat motionless, staring at the manila folder in the drawer of his suitcase. His fingers trembled as he reached for it. He stood, walked to the bed, and looked at his wife. "I'm done," he said quietly. "I've let my mom say a lot of things over the years. I let it slide because it was easier, but not this, not with Alia." Melanie nodded once, and he saw the tears in her eyes. He pulled on his coat. "Where are you going?" she asked. He looked down at the folder in his hand. "I'm going to show her exactly who Alia is." And with that, he stepped out into the cold. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that rang louder than any slammed argument ever could. Outside, the night air was crisp and bit at John's skin as he stepped off the porch into the darkness. The sky above was blanketed in stars, but he didn't see them. The world around him, silent, frozen, painted in white, felt like it had stopped moving. Like everything had crystallized around that single moment when his daughter looked up and asked, "Did Grandma forget mine?" He walked with purpose. Each footfall crunched in the snow. The manila folder felt heavier in his hand than it should have, as if it carried the weight of generations and grief. He had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in his head, long before Alia was born. In arguments he never dared to have. In silences he chose instead of confrontation, but he hadn't done it. Not for Melanie. Not for himself. And now, not doing it meant he had failed Alia. That silence had wrapped around her like a cold chain. The kitchen light was still on when he reached the main house. He didn't knock. He opened the back door the way he had as a boy, the way he'd always done, even as a man returning for short visits or holidays. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately. The scent of pine, vanilla, and nutmeg still lingered in the air. He could hear faint laughter from the front room, his parents and brothers still talking over glasses of wine, pretending the morning hadn't happened. Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, meticulously folding cloth napkins into decorative triangles. Her back was straight. Her expression, even in solitude, was composed. She didn't look up when he entered. "I didn't expect you," she said after a beat, eyes fixed on the napkin in her hands. John didn't answer. He pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. The folder he carried landed softly on the table between them. Margaret's eyes flicked toward it, then back to the napkin. "What is that?" He took a breath and leveled his voice. "I'm not here to fight. I'm not here to ask for an apology. I'm here to give you a choice." She set the napkin down slowly, precisely, and placed her hands in her lap. He pushed the folder toward her. "Open it." Reluctantly, she did. Her fingers were steady as she pulled out the documents. Official forms, notarized letters, the DNA test results, Elia's birth certificate with both his and Melanie's names printed clearly, legal records of guardianship, trust documents, updates to wills and insurance policies. Everything that proved that Elia wasn't just his daughter-in-love, but in every way the law could recognize. Every line was prepared, signed, validated. "I started the paperwork months ago," John said. "I did it in case we ever got to this moment. I hoped we wouldn't, but I knew we might." Margaret's eyes scanned the page in silence. He watched the way her jaw clenched ever so slightly, the way the muscles around her mouth tightened. "Elia is my daughter. She always has been. She always will be. She is family. Mine, Melanie's, and yes, yours, if you choose." Margaret's lips parted as if to speak, but John held up a hand. "I'm not interested in arguments about blood or appearance or whatever justification you've been feeding yourself all these years. I'm not here to explain what love looks like. I'm not here to beg for basic decency." He leaned forward slightly, his voice unwavering. "I'm telling you, plainly, that if you ever refer to Elia again as anything other than your granddaughter, if you treat her as anything less than a full member of this family, you will no longer be part of our lives. Not mine, not Melanie's, and not hers." The silence that followed stretched thin between them, taut and brittle. Margaret looked down at the documents again. Her fingers trembled just once before she let them fall to her lap. "She's just a child," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Yes," John replied, "and today you made that child feel like she didn't belong, like she wasn't worthy of being loved. Do you have any idea what that does to a child?" "She didn't cry," Margaret said, still not looking at him. "No, because she didn't think she was allowed to." His mother exhaled slowly. For a long time she said nothing. The only sounds were the faint murmurs of the family in the other room, the occasional pop of the firewood in the hearth, and the steady hum of the refrigerator behind them. "You've changed," she said at last. John nodded. "I became a father. That changes everything." Margaret finally looked up, and for the first time in a long time, she looked old to him, not aged in body, but weary in spirit. She looked like someone who had just realized the line she had drawn was one she could no longer defend. He stood. "You have one chance to fix this," he said. "One, because next Christmas, if things are the same, we won't be here." Then he turned and walked out, not waiting for her answer, not needing one. Back at the guest house, the lights were dim. Melanie sat on the bed, brushing Elia's hair slowly as the little girl drifted in and out of sleep. John stepped inside and set the folder gently on the nightstand. Melanie looked up. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. He sat beside her, took her hand, and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding his entire life. They didn't talk much after that. There were no long explanations, no tears. Just the sound of Elia's breathing as she slept, the flicker of the nightlight on the wall, and the silent agreement between them that they had done the right thing. That this time they had chosen their daughter above comfort, above peace, above the illusion of harmony. The next morning, something in the house felt different. It wasn't dramatic. The decorations were still perfect. The fire still burned. The music still played softly in the background. But the energy had shifted. The conversations were stilted. The smiles were tighter. Everyone walked as though balancing something fragile. Alia sat at the kitchen table with her cup of hot chocolate, stirring it slowly. She looked better than the day before, but still distant, as though a part of her had gone somewhere quiet. Melanie sat beside her, rubbing slow circles on her back. John stood nearby, watching the snow drift past the window. Then came the knock at the guest house door. Melanie opened it, surprised to see Margaret standing there. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her hair pinned neatly, as always, but her face unguarded. "May I come in?" she asked. Melanie hesitated, then stepped aside. Margaret walked in slowly and approached the kitchen table where Elia sat. In her hands was a medium-sized gift wrapped in silver paper. No ribbon, no tag, just a box. She knelt beside Elia's chair and set the box gently in front of her. "I forgot this yesterday," she said. Elia looked at the box, then at Margaret. She didn't reach for it. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "I made a mistake. I was wrong. I let something in my head convince me that family is only blood, but I forgot that family is love. And you've shown me more love than I've earned." Elia glanced at her mother, unsure. Melanie gave a small nod. Carefully, Elia peeled back the wrapping paper. Inside was a set of professional watercolor paints, a new sketchbook with thick white pages, and a card. She opened the card and read silently, her lips moving, though no one could hear the words. Then she looked at Margaret. "Do you want me to draw you something?" she asked. Margaret's eyes welled. "I'd like that very much." Elia nodded. "Okay." No smile, no dramatic hug, just a quiet, tentative okay. And that was enough. Later, when Margaret left the guest house, John sat on the edge of the bed, the manila folder still on the nightstand beside him. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just looked tired, relieved. "You think it'll last?" Melanie asked. He shrugged. "I don't know, but it's a start." Alia curled up beside them, flipping through her new sketchbook. The fox nestled beside her. And for the first time in days, the air in the room felt soft. Not perfect, not resolved, but healing. A fracture, yes, but maybe not a fatal one. The day they left was gray and still. The snow had stopped falling overnight, and a pale sky hung low above the Vermont hills, heavy with a quiet that was neither cold nor warm, but something in between. The house, with its picture-perfect decorations and impeccable symmetry, seemed less imposing now, less like a fortress and more like a place that had been cracked open, just slightly at the seams. John loaded the suitcases into the trunk without speaking. Melanie stood on the porch with Elia, gently pulling the girl's scarf tighter around her neck. Margaret watched them from the kitchen window. She didn't come out to say goodbye. She didn't wave, but she didn't look away either. Elia clutched her sketchbook to her chest as she climbed into the back seat. Her fox was tucked under one arm, as always. She buckled herself in without being asked and settled into her seat with the quiet maturity that seemed to have grown overnight. She didn't speak until they were halfway down the long gravel drive, when the house behind them was only just visible through the trees. "Daddy," she said softly. "Yes, baby?" "I drew something for Grandma. I'll send it to her when we get home." John glanced at Melanie, who met his eyes briefly before turning back to face forward. "That's a kind idea," he said. "I think she'll appreciate it." Elia nodded and returned to her sketchbook, opening to a fresh page. She began to draw in slow, deliberate lines, something she'd imagined during the long hours of not being seen, something only she could give shape to. The ride home was quiet, but not in the way it had been before. It wasn't the silence of dread or tension, but something gentler. a peace born of having faced something hard and walked through it. Melanie watched the snow-covered landscape pass outside the window, her thoughts drifting in and out like the trees along the road. She wasn't ready to forgive, not fully, but she could breathe again. That was something. John drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting loosely on the console, occasionally brushing his fingers against Melanie's when she reached for his. He wasn't thinking about the documents anymore. He wasn't planning another confrontation. He was thinking about Elia's voice when she asked her question at breakfast. Do you think she didn't know I was coming? It had broken something in him, but maybe it had also freed him. There was nothing more to defend. He knew who his daughter was, and now, so did his mother. Back at home, their apartment felt smaller than they remembered, but safe, warm, familiar. The lights on their little tree still blinked in the corner of the living room. The couch was draped with the same old fleece blanket, and the fridge still held the gingerbread cookies Elia had made before the trip. It smelled like them again, like cinnamon and sugar and home. They unpacked slowly. Melanie folded Elia's dresses and tucked them into drawers. John placed the unopened gifts under their own tree and turned on the fireplace video on the television. Elia padded through the house in her socks, trailing a line of crayons and pencils behind her as she settled at the kitchen table with her new paints and sketchbook. It became her routine in the days that followed. Every afternoon after lunch, she would sit at the table and draw, sometimes animals, sometimes trees, sometimes little girls who looked suspiciously like her, though she never said as much. Melanie would peek in from the hallway and watch her daughter bent over her work, her brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers stained with watercolor. One day, a small envelope arrived in the mail. There was no return address, only Margaret's neat handwriting on the front. Inside was a single photograph, an old one of John as a child, no more than 5 or 6, standing in front of the fireplace in that same Vermont house, his mother's hand resting on his shoulder. On the back, in that same careful script, were the words, "Family is who you fight for." I see that now. Thank you for fighting for her. No one cried. No one read it aloud. John slipped the photograph into a drawer in his desk and didn't mention it again. Winter settled around them, deep and soft. Elia started school again after the new year and came home each afternoon with stories about recess and spelling, and a girl named Ava who shared her fruit snacks. She asked Melanie if she could take her fox in her backpack, just on Mondays, and whether they could sign her up for the school art club. Melanie said yes to all of it. John started working longer hours again, but every night he made it home in time for dinner, for bedtime, for the story that Elia always insisted he read, even if she already knew every word. Sometimes it was the same book 3 nights in a row. Sometimes it was something new, but he never refused. And in those quiet evenings, with the world outside muffled by snow, their little family stitched itself back together. Elia never asked to visit Vermont again. She didn't bring up the gifts. She didn't mention the silence, the looks, the way she had been left out. But she also didn't hide. She didn't shrink. Whatever had broken inside her had been rebuilt, stronger than before. One evening in February, she sat at the table with a new drawing, this one more detailed than any she had done before. It was a scene, a house with a wide porch and a tall tree in the yard. In front of it stood 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl holding hands. Behind them, slightly to the side, was another figure, a woman with silver hair. She wasn't at the center, but she was there. Elia showed it to John and Melanie without saying anything. John smiled and kissed her forehead. "That's exactly what we are," he said. And Elia, without looking up from the page, added one more line of color to the sky, a golden sun with a soft, smiling face. She didn't need to explain it. They understood. Later that night, Melanie sat at the edge of the bed, watching John pull off his socks and drop them into the hamper. "I think she forgave her," she said quietly. John glanced at her. "I think she never hated her to begin with." Melanie nodded. "Do you think your mom knows that?" He thought for a moment. "I think she's trying to earn it anyway. That's more than I ever expected." They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't make plans for next Christmas or wonder whether Margaret would visit or call or fade back into the comfort of old habits. They simply existed in the present, where their daughter knew she was loved, where her art bloomed across the pages of her sketchbook like petals opening in winter. In March, a package arrived, wrapped clumsily, the tape uneven, the handwriting a little shaky. Inside was a children's book about foxes, a tin of watercolor pencils, and a card that read, "I saw this and thought of you, your grandma." Elia opened it at the kitchen table and stared at the contents for a long time before speaking. "Do you think she really means it?" she asked. Melanie sat beside her. "I think she's learning." Elia considered that. Then she smiled and reached for her paints. She didn't say anything else. But later, John found a new drawing tucked between the pages of her sketchbook. A fox sitting at a kitchen table with a teacup in its paw, wearing a pair of spectacles and looking out a window at the snow. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't need to. There was still healing to be done. Wounds that didn't close overnight. But something had changed. Not in loud declarations or dramatic reconciliations, but in the soft, daily effort to be better. To choose love again and again, even when it wasn't easy. The second attempt hadn't been perfect, but it had been real, and that was enough. By the time the snow melted and the first soft hints of spring crept into the corners of their neighborhood, Elia had filled 2 sketchbooks completely. They sat on the bookshelf in her room, their spines worn, the pages curling slightly at the edges. Melanie didn't look through them unless she was invited, but sometimes when Elia was at school, she'd gently lift a cover and leaf through the pages. There were animals, forests, fairy tales, but always somewhere a little girl, sometimes alone, sometimes holding hands, sometimes standing under a tree, arms outstretched toward the sun. One morning in April, a letter arrived addressed in that same, now familiar, careful script. Inside was a card with a picture of a painted teacup on the front and a short message in blue ink. "I'm still learning. Tell Elia I think about her every day. Love, Grandma." There was no gift this time, no apology, just presence. Quiet and plain. Melanie showed it to Elia after school. The girl read it slowly, then read it again. "She's still learning?" she asked, looking up. Melanie smiled. "I think we all are." Elia nodded. "Okay." She took the card and placed it inside her newest sketchbook between 2 blank pages. She didn't say anything else, and Melanie didn't push. It was enough. As the months passed, the memory of that Christmas didn't vanish, but it softened. The sharp edges dulled. John no longer carried that manila folder everywhere in his mind. He still thought about what had been said, about the silence in that living room, the way no one had stood up, but he no longer burned with it. The fire had done its work. It had cleared what needed clearing. What remained now was the rebuilding. Margaret began calling once a week, short calls at first. She asked about school, about art, about what Elia liked to eat for breakfast. Melanie didn't always join. Sometimes she sat nearby, listening, evaluating, but each time the voice on the other end of the phone was softer, more searching. Not perfect, but no longer armed with distance. One Sunday, Elia asked if she could draw something to mail with the next reply. She folded a page carefully into thirds and drew a picture of a grandmother and granddaughter sitting under a tree. The girl was holding a paintbrush. The grandmother held a book. They weren't touching, but they were close. The sun beamed down on them both. John mailed it the next day. The seasons shifted. Summer bloomed. They took a short trip to a nearby lake, stayed in a small cabin, watched Elia wade into the water with the same curiosity she brought to everything. She collected rocks and gave each one a name. She found a flat, speckled stone and said it looked like Grandma's voice, soft and gray and a little bit rough. John and Melanie exchanged a glance at that, not sure whether to laugh or cry. In August, a package arrived wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a framed copy of a photograph John had never seen before. Margaret, as a young woman, seated in a garden, holding an infant in her arms. The note attached read, "I thought Elia might like to see what her grandmother looked like once upon a time." It was a small gesture, but it wasn't meaningless. When school resumed in the fall, Elia began talking about her classmates' holiday plans. Some were going to Florida, others to ski. One girl said her whole family came to her house for Christmas and stayed up until midnight drinking hot cocoa and singing. Elia listened to it all quietly, then turned to Melanie that night at bedtime. "Will we go back to Grandma's this Christmas?" Melanie hesitated. "Do you want to?" Elia thought for a long time. "Only if we go as a whole family." Melanie smoothed her hair back. "We are a whole family, baby." Elia nodded. "Okay." They didn't commit to the visit right away. John waited to see what the fall would bring, whether the conversations would continue, whether the effort would stay. And it did. Margaret never asked to be forgiven. She never tried to rewrite the past. But she showed up in her own way. Birthday cards, phone calls, little stories she told on speakerphone. She asked questions now, real ones. She listened. She remembered details. In late November, she called and said simply, "If you come, there will be a stocking with her name on it. There will be a seat at the table. There will be a gift with her name. And there will be no question about whether she belongs." John sat with that for a while. Then he turned to Melanie and Elia, sitting together on the couch, coloring in a book of animals with wild fur and soft eyes. "She said the right things," he told them. Melanie's expression didn't change. "Saying and doing are different." "I know," he said, "but maybe it's worth seeing." They decided to go. This time, the drive felt different. Not light exactly, but less heavy. Elia packed her fox, her sketchbook, and a small envelope of new drawings she had made just for Grandma. She didn't talk about which gift she thought was hers. She didn't hum Christmas songs in the back seat. But she didn't ask to stay home either. And that, John knew, meant more than words. When they arrived at the house, the wreath was the same. The lights were the same, but something in the air had shifted. Margaret opened the door and hugged John first, then Melanie, then knelt and opened her arms to Elia. Elia didn't move at first. Then she stepped forward, slowly, and let herself be held. Inside, the house was warm, the fire was lit, the table was set, and hanging from the mantel were stockings for every child, every cousin, and one with Elia's name stitched in silver thread. She stood in front of it for a long time, just looking. Later that night, as the family gathered in the living room, Margaret passed around hot chocolate and offered everyone a turn, sharing their favorite Christmas memory. When it was Elia's turn, she stood and said, "My favorite memory is drawing with Mommy at home while Daddy reads. That's when I feel most cozy." No one interrupted her, no one shifted awkwardly, they just listened. And when she sat down, Margaret reached over and touched her hand. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "I hope you'll draw something here, too." Elia looked at her. "I brought my sketchbook." The next morning, there was a box under the tree wrapped in purple paper with a snowman. Elia didn't look surprised. She opened it with care, revealing a wooden art box filled with new paints, brushes, pencils, and a handwritten note. "I see you. I'm glad you're here." She looked at the note for a long time. Then she tucked it into the cover of her sketchbook, beside the old card from the spring. That afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table where she had once been forgotten and drew quietly, her hand steady, her back straight. She drew a little girl holding hands with two taller figures, a house behind them, a tree to the right. And beside the tree, standing a few steps away, was a woman with silver hair, holding a cup of tea. She titled it, "The Road Home." John saw it later that evening. He didn't say anything, just kissed her forehead and sat beside her until the light in the room turned golden and the day slowly faded into night. And in that stillness, wrapped in the quiet of winter, they began again. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had been acknowledged. Because home, once broken, had opened just wide enough to let something new grow. The days leading up to Christmas passed more gently than the year before. There was no tension in the air as they decorated their modest tree, no knots in John's chest as he hung Elia's stocking next to his and Melanie's, no silent bracing in anticipation of what might go wrong. It wasn't that everything had become perfect, but that something vital had shifted. The weight of uncertainty, of watching for harm in places that should be safe, had begun to lift. Elia had grown in ways that were hard to measure. She still wore her favorite cardigan until the sleeves curled around her wrists, still named every squirrel she saw, still whispered stories to her fox as she drifted off to sleep. But there was something steadier in her now, something more rooted. She spoke more in class, her teacher said. She volunteered to help the younger kids during recess, and when a classmate once asked her why she looked different from her daddy, she simply said, "Because my family is made from love, not mirrors," then returned to her drawing. Melanie carried that sentence with her for days. The final week before the holiday, Margaret called again. Her voice was softer now, slower, no longer filled with clipped precision. She asked about the weather, about Elia's school, about the cookies they were baking. She didn't mention the past. She didn't press for reassurance. She simply stayed on the line and listened. "I'd like to send something," she said before they hung up. "Not just for Elia, for all of you." John didn't ask what it was. He said thank you and meant it. When the box arrived a few days later, it was carefully wrapped in brown paper, tied with simple string. Inside were 3 smaller packages. One was a new storybook, its pages illustrated with soft brush strokes and handwritten notations in the margins, little notes that said things like, "Elia might like this part," and "reminds me of you." Another was a pair of woolen mittens Melanie recognized from a shop they had once visited years ago in Vermont, the kind she had admired but never bought. And the third was a letter, handwritten and long. Melanie read it aloud at the kitchen table. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't rewrite history. It said simply, "I am trying. I see now how much I missed when I thought I knew best. And I hope you will let me keep learning, Not because I deserve it, but because she does. Because Alea deserves everything the word family can mean. Alia didn't say anything at first. She just traced the edges of the letter with her finger, then stood and walked to her room. A few minutes later, she returned with one of her framed drawings, a fox and a girl sitting in a field of wildflowers, and placed it on the counter. "You can send her this," she said. "Tell her it's for the guest room, in case we visit again." John smiled and placed his hand gently on her back. That Christmas morning, they stayed home. It was a quiet day, wrapped in warmth and the scent of cinnamon rolls. Elia opened her gifts slowly, thoughtfully. Each one had been chosen with care. A new set of paints, a collection of storybooks, a miniature easel for her bedroom. She said thank you after every one, always looking the giver in the eye. When she opened the last box and found inside a single folded page, Margaret's letter from the week before, now hand-copied in elegant cursive, accompanied by a photo of Margaret as a child sitting beside her own mother. She paused, then asked Melanie if she could hang it beside her bookshelf. "She looks like she's learning," Elia said. Melanie kissed the top of her head. "She is." Later that afternoon, they went for a walk through the park near their home. Snow had fallen the night before and left everything softened, blanketed in white. Elia ran ahead, her fox peeking from the pocket of her coat, her laughter carrying across the cold air like wind chimes. John walked beside Melanie, his hand in hers. "She's not afraid anymore," he said. "No," Melanie agreed. "She isn't." They walked in silence for a while, watching their daughter make patterns in the snow with her boots. "You were right," Melanie said at last. "All those months ago, about needing to draw the line." John didn't respond at first. Then he said, "I just wish I hadn't waited until it hurt her." "She's okay," Melanie said. "You made sure of that." Back at home, Elia spent the evening curled up with her sketchbook. She had a habit now of titling each drawing, even if she didn't show anyone. She wrote the titles in tiny letters at the bottom corner of the page, sometimes funny, sometimes poetic, always her own. That night, she drew a picture of 3 people in a living room. A man, a woman, and a little girl sitting on the floor surrounded by open books and scraps of wrapping paper. At the edge of the drawing, a 4th figure stood in the doorway, watching with a quiet smile. The figure had silver hair and a scarf wrapped around her shoulders. In the girl's hand was a card that said, "You belong." She titled the drawing, "Chosen Again." Melanie found it the next morning and stared at it for a long time before showing it to John. "She gets it," she said. John nodded. "Better than most adults." A week later, Elia brought the picture to school for show and tell. She told her classmates that she'd drawn her family. Someone asked who the lady in the doorway was. "That's my grandma," she said. "She didn't always know how to be one, but she's learning now." And no one laughed. No one questioned her. They just nodded, as children do, accepting the truth as it was given. As the year came to a close, John and Melanie found themselves reflecting more often, not with bitterness, but with clarity. They had spent so long hoping that love would be enough on its own. That family, by nature, would accept. But now they knew better. Family wasn't who claimed you when it was easy. It was who stood beside you when it was hard, who saw you fully and said, "You belong to me," not because of obligation, but because of choice. Elia had always belonged. They had known that. What changed was that now the world around her began to reflect that truth back to her, not in grand gestures, not in dramatic scenes, but in the daily deliberate act of showing up. That spring, they visited Vermont again. Not for Christmas, not out of pressure, but because Aaliyah asked. She wanted to see the tree again, to hang her drawing in the guest room herself. She wanted to bake cookies in the big kitchen and walk through the snow-covered garden. This time, when they arrived, Margaret met them at the door with arms wide open. No hesitation, no forced smiles. Just a grandmother, learning. And that night, as the fire crackled and Elia fell asleep with her fox in one hand and her sketchbook in the other, Melanie whispered to John, "She's home." Not because the house had changed, but because the people inside it had. There were still things to work through, moments to heal. But they had started the most important part. They had drawn the line, stood their ground, and made space for love to grow. And Aaliyah, bright and brave and full of grace, had offered forgiveness not for the sake of others, but for herself. When people asked how their Christmas had been that year, John and Melanie never gave a long answer. They simply said, "It was the year something broke, and something better began." Because sometimes the greatest gift isn't the one wrapped in paper, but the one wrapped in presence, in effort, in the quiet, unwavering choice to say again and again, "You belong." If this story meant something to you, subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And check out the next video too. It's waiting for you.